Well, welcome to this midweek reflection from NWBA, something that we're offering alongside our weekly Sunday services to support you in your ongoing journey through these challenging times. And I don't want to make light of anything that people are going through at the moment. I'm all too aware of how tough things are for some of us. And I also want to say that I recognise that while many, like me, are largely having to adjust to this life of isolation, others of you are out there day after day, putting yourselves on the line as key workers, and I want to thank you for that. And I hope that anyone watching these videos will commit to praying for you and doing all we can to express our appreciation for what you're doing for our nation right now. But we're all having to live life in a very different way, whether we're frontline workers, whether we're in isolation. And I made the point at the outset of this time that much of what we're experiencing now is something that people of various religions will, including Christianity, will often do in the name of retreat. We'll deliberately put ourselves in a different and unfamiliar place and from that be open to what new lessons and insights we might gain from that, making the time to be mindful and to be prayerful. And whether you call yourself a Christian or not, I hope to offer you the chance to do that. And yes, in my case, I'm going to base that on some of the narratives from our Christian faith. But I hope that anyone will find value in them. So one of those stories that we often reflect on as Christians is the story of a guy called Elijah. And we read about him in an ancient Jewish history document called the Book of Kings, which is preserved for us today in the text of the Bible. And the bit that I want to read from is in the 19th chapter of the first book of Kings. Now, let me try and set the scene. Elijah is a well-known religious leader, but he finds himself completely at odds with the ruling monarch, who set out on a pathway that's totally against everything that Elijah believes and knows to be right. And there's a constant antagonism, particularly between the queen and Elijah. And as is so often true for prophets of truth who upset the powers that be, Elijah ends up as an exile and a fugitive. But the time and opportunity comes for a showdown that totally vindicates Elijah. The cronies of the queen are exposed for what they are, the drought-ridden land begins to heal, and Elijah just proves himself to be a true prophet of God. And this is a religious drama, so Elijah is seen to have been vindicated by God, even sending fire from heaven. He could not have been more of a success. But word gets back to the queen, and the queen is out to get him. And this is where we pick up the story in this book of Kings. The queen was told everything Elijah had done to her prophets. And so she sent a messenger to him to say, "By this time tomorrow, I will make your life like one of them." Now Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. He went alone into the wilderness and came to a broom tree, and under it he sat down and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." And then he lay down and fell asleep. And all at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." And he looked around, and there at his head was baked bread and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel came back a second time. "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." And strengthened by that food, he travelled for 40 days and nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The people have rejected your covenant and torn down your altars and put your prophets to death, and I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too." And the Lord said to him, "Go out and stand on the mountain in my presence, for I am about to pass by." And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks. But God was not in the wind. And then there was an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire. But God was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper, a still small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood in the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The people have rejected your covenant and torn down your altars and put your prophets to death. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me." Now, when you look at the contrast in Elijah's experience, you might sense something of the life changes that many of us have been through in recent days. One minute he's out there, centre stage, doing his thing, everything's going his way, and then suddenly, bang, he's on his own. He's tired and afraid, even suicidal in his thinking. It's right there in the story. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it and prayed that he might die. Now, I hope your struggles haven't quite led you to the place that Elijah found himself in. But I sense that we can all relate to some of the emotions and despondency that emerge from that story. And yet, it is a story of hope. It's a story that tracks his emotional and spiritual journey from this absolute low to a place of recovery and recommissioning and a deep sense of inner peace through the presence of God. So whether you feel as desperate as Elijah did or whether you are trying to avoid reaching that place, I sense there's a lot of good that we might gain from retracing his steps. So let's start with that phrase. He prayed that he might die. Now, if this story wasn't so tragic, it would actually be comical. The queen threatens to kill him. So he runs for his life, and when he gets to a place of safety, he prays that he might die. Well, if you wanted to die, Elijah, you should have stayed where you were. But I don't say that to make light of the situation, but rather to highlight that when we're down, when we're in a place of despair, our thoughts don't make sense. Things get all out of perspective. And if we're not careful, those disturbed and irrational thoughts can do us an awful lot of harm. One part of him is trying to protect himself. The other half is ready to give up. There's this inner battle going on within Elijah. But he prayed that he might die. Don't let that fact pass you by. Now, if I asked you, what is a prayer? You might think of the Lord's Prayer, or maybe a prayer we learn to recite at school. A prayer is a polished, carefully phrased narrative that we politely say together when we're in church. Well, not for Elijah. His prayer was a cry of desperation, an irrational, confused cry for help. And the fact that we find this story in the Bible, the fact that we find this prayer on the lips of a great figure in the history of God's people, says to me that this kind of praying is okay. And if that's how you're feeling right now, then don't hold it in. Don't be afraid of telling God. And if there's a trusted friend or colleague or even a local minister you can ring, don't be afraid of telling them either. One clear message from this story is don't bottle it up. Let go. And whoever else you can or cannot tell, you can certainly tell God. And maybe you are a frontline or key worker. Maybe like Elijah in the days before this episode, you know what it's like to be there right in the middle of it all, and then you come home. And the reality of it all just becomes too much to bear. Then share it, talk about it, tell God about it, tell others about it. Maybe Elijah's prayer is one that you can all too easily relate to. I've had enough, Lord. I'm not up to this. But he prayed it, and God listened to it. So how does God respond to this desperate, irrational cry for help? With some great divine oracle? With some deep religious experience? Well, yeah, that's coming. But God's immediate response is food and sleep. Don't reduce God to what we might call the religious stuff. God is the God of everything. And God can see what Elijah needs before anything else is food and water and sleep. And from this, we can glean a very simple and a very obvious message. Look after yourself. Whether you're in isolation and lockdown, or whether you're on the front line out there, this disruption is going to take its toll on you. Take care of yourself. Your ordinary everyday needs like sleep and food and exercise, these things matter. They matter for you and they matter to God. And then, and only then, strengthened for that journey, Elijah heads for Mount Horeb, the sacred mountain known as a meeting place with God. Now straight away I can imagine you thinking, hang on, we're in lockdown. I'm watching videos like this because I can't get to those sacred spaces, whether it's my local church or my favourite beauty spot. I can't go to those places where I find my strength and peace. You've chosen the wrong story here. Well, okay, I get that. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But for now, try to think about what that journey represented. It was a journey back through and beyond all of the stuff that Elijah had been through, back to the roots of his identity and faith, back to the core of why he did what he did and why he was going through what he was going through. And I sense that for many of us, the current situation is making us stop and think about what really matters, to peel away all those routines and expectations that life throws our way, to have taken from us the things we're used to, and then to look again at what really matters and recognise what is of true value in this world. You know, we're even seeing that in our attitudes towards the roles that people play in society. We're starting to recognise what jobs really matter, which things are really valuable. And I would encourage us to embrace those lessons. You know, it would be a tragedy if we emerged from this period in our shared life and didn't inhabit and bring from it those realities that we've learned. So I would encourage you to embrace what's happening at the moment, and maybe to help that recalibrate you, because I think it might actually do us some good. You know, so often in our scriptures, when we read of people facing situations of dismay and fear, the outcome of their prayers is very often not for the situation to change, but for them to re-understand things and recognise that some of the stuff that they were afraid of or bothered about isn't quite what it seemed. And this kind of leads us to the final step that Elijah takes. He comes to a cave on the sacred mountain, and once again he just tells it to God like it is. I've done my best, but I've failed. I feel rejected. Everything I've worked for has been torn down. Those of us who've been faithful have been persecuted and destroyed, and I feel alone and vulnerable. Like I said, God is not afraid of us telling him how it is. And then the story reaches its climax in this somewhat obscure narrative. There's an earthquake and there's a wind and there's a fire. And I guess that these are all metaphors that we could attach to what we're going through at the moment. Our planet has certainly been shaken by a disease that I've heard more than one person describe as spreading like wildfire. Winds of change and uncertainty are blasting through our world at the moment. We are suffering the earthquake, the wind and the fire. And I guess it's natural for religious people to look for God in those things. You know, I've heard it asked, is this God's judgment on us? Is this the end of the world? And if we believe that God is the creator of the world, then yes, all of these things can be reminders of God's power and authority. But God is not to be found in them. It's not in the events themselves that God is speaking, but God is speaking. Speaking through what is often translated as a still, small voice. And I think that serves to remind us that we need to think carefully about who we listen to in current days. Elijah needed to see and hear a lot of things that would have grabbed his attention before he really recognised that he was hearing God's voice. Not every voice that you hear at the moment will be God's voice. Not every explanation that you hear at the moment will be God's explanation. Listen carefully, listen cautiously, but listen. because God's still small voice is speaking. Now remember, I pointed out that this was a sacred mountain, a special place, a sort of place that we're just not allowed to go to at the moment. Well, think about that for a minute. Elijah experienced stuff in this sacred space that was definitely not God speaking. And he experienced stuff that definitely was. And what this says to me is that finding God is not a matter of managing to be in the right place, though I know that these places can help. But what matters is that we learn to listen to the right voice. And we listen to that voice wherever we find ourselves. And that's something that we all can do right now. So yes, this is about learning to find God's voice where we are, not about waiting to get back to the familiar places that perhaps we've heard it. And then, at the end of the story, Elijah is invited to speak again. And what I find fascinating is that he says exactly what he said before. Nothing's changed, except everything's changed. Previously, he thought these things were evidence that God had somehow deserted him. Now, they became the reality that he feels able to embrace because he knows that God is present. So yes, none of us can do very much to change the circumstances that we're faced with at the moment. And none of us can pretend that those circumstances are not laced with challenge and pain and uncertainty. But we can transform our experience of them by discovering God's presence in our own struggle. And the simple steps that Elijah takes are steps that we could take too. First, he doesn't hold it in. He's honest about his despair, and he's not afraid of saying so. Tell God how it is for you. Second, he eats and drinks and rests. His mental and spiritual well-being relies on him looking after his physical self too. So let's take care of ourselves. Thirdly, he gets back to the heart of what really matters and reaches a place that represents the true values and purpose of his humanity and faith. And then finally, he learns to listen for God's voice. Not just the noise of the circumstances around him, but to listen out in the midst of that for that still small voice of God speaking. And this simple prayer that I would offer with these reflections is that God's Spirit will enable you to do the same. Thanks for listening.